Welcome to Stop Overthinking, the podcast for overthinkers, people pleasers, and perfectionists who want to feel calm and confident enough to handle whatever life sends your way. I'm your host, Kristen Odegaard, a women's life and mindset coach, lifelong educator, and recovering perfectionist. Welcome back to the Stop Overthinking podcast. So today we're actually going to talk about overthinking. And this came from a conversation that I had this week with someone on how do you know if you're overthinking or if you're just thinking? And what if you're a planner or a processor? When is it overthinking versus productive thinking? Since this is a podcast called Stop Overthinking, that is a really great question. So I'm going to share some thoughts with you on this topic today. I want to start with, to some degree, we all overthink and overanalyze. And this is because there's just so much information in the world. And we also have constant access to it with our phones and our tablets and computers and TV and radio. We get messages and data and notifications all the time. So we are overthinking. And one thing to do is simply just be cautious as to what you let into your mind. Just like you have limits on who gets into your house or into your car or into your office, you can create limits and boundaries for yourself on how much of that information you're being exposed to on a daily basis. In prepping for this podcast, I came across a statistic from 2022 that said in the US, people are processing about 74 gigabytes of information a day. That's the equivalent of like 15 or 16 movies. And this is what your brain is doing on a daily basis. That is a huge amount of information. So in addition to just having that information like being exposed to you, your brain also has to decide what to do with this each and every moment. Like, do I need to process this? How do I interpret it? Where do I store it? Is there emotion? What, do I express myself? So all of this is just to say, give yourself some grace that most people are dealing with this in the world today. We are dealing with overwhelm and overthinking due to the sheer amount of information that is put in front of us daily. The other point I'll offer to you that keeps your brain going excessively is that while the quantity of information and data has increased, the quality has decreased. There is so much information out there that requires no research, sometimes no critical thought, and sometimes it has no meaning at all. So your brain also has to work hard to decipher and determine, like, does this pertain to me? Is it true? Is it relevant? Is it valid? Does this even make sense? And in the social sciences, there's a concept about cognitive load. We're being exposed to all of this. We have to figure out, like, is it true? Does it make sense? Do I want to pay attention to it? But the cognitive load is also all of the insignificant and inconsequential sounds that are going on around us. And this is especially true in like cities where you have sirens and traffic and just noise and people all the time. Or if you're in work environments like factories or construction sites. So then you have to filter that stuff out. So overthinking has become the norm. And to simply say, stop it, doesn't work. Or you probably wouldn't be listening to this podcast. It's just not that easy. You can't just stop it. And you can't tell somebody else to stop it either. So how do you tell the difference between productive thinking and overthinking? And one way is to consider the amount of time that you are spending thinking about the topic. And time is relative. And so it's really going to depend on the context in this situation. Like if you are working on a mega project at work and it's going to span months, you're going to spend more time planning and executing and considering this project. It's going to take up more brain power, and it should. So based on the scale of the task or the action that you're doing, you can determine how much time is reasonable, and you're going to have to use your own judgment here. But the bigger the task, the project, or the bigger the impact of whatever you're doing, more time is probably appropriate. On the other hand, spending hours and days analyzing and rehashing a 5-minute conversation isn't necessarily proportionate. That's overthinking. Another consideration is that productive thinking generally leads to action, whereas overthinking generally leads to inaction. Overthinking is just staying in your brain. Effective, productive thinking will lead to actions or growth or productivity or some sort of movement or momentum. There's a purpose for it. Yet overthinking doesn't lead to that positive action. And other types of thinking that don't lead to positive action, I'm going to wrap up and say that gossip and comparison and complaining and worrying fit in that category with overthinking. I often refer to these as indulgent emotions or indulgent actions because they're a complete waste of time and they don't have positive forward action. The other thing that is almost always overthinking is when you are wanting things to have happened differently in the past, whether that's a conversation, an interaction with a person, or maybe entire situations like you regret making a job change. Rehashing the past is generally overthinking unless you are using it to think about it differently and doing some planned future action. So, when I was considering launching a podcast, for example, I thought about it for months before I even started researching or talking to people or really considering what I would need to do to commit to a weekly podcast. So, some people might say that this was overthinking because I spent close to a year pretty much in my head before I took action, before I had conversations, before I ordered the microphone or set up my online accounts or found the editor for my episodes. So some people could say that was procrastination or stalling or maybe even failure because it took so long. But for me, and now I've been recording this weekly podcast for over 6 months with no plans to stop, that was productive time in order to figure out who I'm talking to. What was going to be my purpose? Did I really want to commit? How was this going to fit into my schedule? It was productive time that led to sustainable actions going forward. So your own self-awareness is really important because some people do need to process more than others, and only you know how much time is too much. And you might need to give yourself some self-imposed deadlines, like I'm going to decide what I'm going to do by October 15th, or I'm not going to overanalyze this conversation anymore, and just make a decision to shut it down when you get into that loop. Because overthinking is essentially repeating the same thought, having the same feelings without any intentional thought of how can I be better? What can I change? What can I do about this? How can I shift out of this? It's just spinning in the thinking with no future plan of action. So if you notice that you are overthinking, you're probably going to want to know, great, you told me I can't just stop it. So what do I do? And last week's episode, we talked about stopping negative self-talk. And there were 2 methods that I talked about that will also work when you find yourself overthinking. So that first method is to firmly say no. When you notice that you're overthinking, you tell yourself, no, not going there. And then you move your body, you shake your arms, you walk around. If you notice you're overthinking, you're like, no, 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 I'm not going to do this right now. And then some sort of movement to help you reset. It can even just be sitting in a chair and shaking your arms or, rolling your shoulders. The second option to shut down the overthinking is more of a loving engagement, having some compassion. So it's like, oh, I'm overthinking again. Take a breath and notice it. You might even say to yourself, like, it makes sense that I'm going through this because I've done it for a really long time and it's familiar, but I'm not going to do this today. and then you move your body again. So both of those methods have the same result. They're going to cut off the behavior. You just get to decide whether you're going to do it firmly or lovingly. But either way, you're stopping the overthinking. And there might be times that you need to be powerful and firm with yourself, and others when you need to use compassion and love. So just use whatever method feels better in the moment. And you can certainly go back to that episode about learning to trust yourself and listen for more details and listening with the context of overthinking. So we know that overthinking is common, yet you can be self-aware and notice when the thinking isn't proportional to the situation or the event. And you just know that you need to get out of your head. It's also overthinking when you're having the same thoughts, the same feelings over and over, and you're doing nothing about it. And you can use one of those methods, to be firm or to be loving, to shut it down. You can even distract yourself, and that can be effective as well, to just switch and do something else. Things with movement. That's why exercise can also work really well to reset that brain from overthinking as well. So this week, practice noticing and then stopping your overthinking habits, and let me know how it goes. Have a good week. Talk to you next time. Thank you for listening to the Stop Overthinking podcast with Kristen Odegaard. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else who would benefit from the message. To learn more about working with me and links to social media and free resources, head over to my website, coachwithkristen.com. That's Kristen spelled Kristen. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. Have a great week.